Not everything described in the Bible is something that was approved of by God. And this is where people get confused because they think that if the Bible is describing an event, it automatically means that God approved of it. That is not the case. The Bible is written in both descriptive and prescriptive language. Descriptive language is when the Bible is simply describing the events as they took place. Prescriptive language is when God explicitly approves of something, or the Bible is explicitly telling us, the Word of God is explicitly telling us to do something or not to do something. Something that God approved of, something that God disapproved of, something that God ordained, something that He did not ordain. That is prescriptive language. For example, when the Bible describes Lot's daughters sleeping with him, committing incest, which is explicitly described as sinful by God, and then giving birth to the Moabites and the Ammonites, which were the enemies of Israel in the Bible, that is simply the Bible describing what happened and what took place. That is not saying that God approved of it. And we know that He didn't approve of it because, again, He explicitly disapproved of incest. Or when the Bible describes King Solomon going directly against God's will by having multiple wives, because the Bible explicitly said and instructed kings not to take multiple wives, that is not God approving of King Solomon's disobedience, because God explicitly instructed his kings not to take multiple wives. That is the Bible simply describing what happens. And in fact, in King Solomon's case, the Word of God explicitly says that towards the latter end of his life, he turned away from God because of the multiple women he married, and they turned him towards idolatry. So we see that that clearly was not God's will for Solomon's life. It's important to understand this so that we don't think that everything that is being described in the Bible is God's will. The wonderful thing about the Bible is that it doesn't try to sugarcoat people's sins. It's very plain and open about people's sins and God's redemptive power. And just because God is able to work through men's sins and produce something good in the end does not mean that He approved of those sins to begin with. There's another passage in the Bible where the Pharisees come to Jesus and they ask Him something about whether it's permissible for a man to divorce his wife. And Jesus takes them back to Genesis, which was God's original will for marriage. And He literally tells them, have you not heard that in the beginning, He made them male and female, and the two shall become one flesh, and what God has put together, let no man separate? God's original intention since Genesis was for one man and one wife to come together in holy matrimony. And Jesus affirmed that in the Gospels. So again, when the Bible describes people's behavior, it does not mean that God approved of it. Or when the Bible describes events, that does not mean that God approved of things. We know what God explicitly approves of and disapproves of because He will explicitly tell us what He approves of and what He disapproves of in the Word of God.